So I'm Simon Knell and this is Lizanne Gibson. We're both going to be talking about research that we've been doing in recent years, but research that leads into teaching as well. And it's just a way to really think about museums and start to probe what museums are. There's about 14 academics in the department. We all have a really very different perspective. Some of us are looking from the outside in the institution. Some like Lizanne look at the institution within a much broader context of engagement. Some are working with practitioners and are aiming their work to change the museum. I'm very much, at the moment, I used to work in museums, but these days I like to look in and see the strangeness of these institutions. So what I've been doing for the last few years is travelling the world looking at national galleries. So you can do it, you might as well. So what I want to do is to talk, so I had a book that came out just a couple of weeks ago that was a result of this research, to look globally at national galleries, and not just look at national galleries as great galleries, but to look at them wherever they are, and particularly to look from a political perspective as to how they can contribute to the construction of a nation. Okay.
I think, hold on.
Oh no, it's not on this one.
Oh.
So if you, anyone been to the National Gallery in London? Okay, so if you think of this as a typical national gallery, you're wrong, because they're not at all like this around the world. You would find some exactly like this in Australia maybe, but in lots of the parts of the world you wouldn't find a national gallery like this at all. And actually, galleries like this are actually quite rare. And world-class galleries like this, national galleries, there are only about 12 or something like that on the planet. But they, as you can see, they look, and this has been sort of stretched by this screen, but you can see they look very conservative and to do with the display of old master painting, but they're more than this. Of course they can be reinvented, like Tate Modern, that's also a national gallery. It's a social space. I think people visit that gallery very differently to those people that go to Trafalgar Square and visit the National Gallery. There's a different thing going on there, it's a different vibe to that particular space. But if we were to look at these kinds of institutions and think about them politically, then we might see something quite different. And actually, the building of Tate Modern was looked at from around the world by governments as a way that the nation could reshape its identity. It was very influential. So one example we could look at, for example, is this stretched out. It's taller and not as wide as it looks on this screen. So the National Gallery in Berlin, for example, which opened when Germany became unified. So this is in Berlin, which is the centre of Prussia, part of an old fragmented Germany, which came about at the end of the Holy Roman Empire. In the 19th century it started to build itself back together again, and Prussia led that. It sometimes did it by fighting with its neighbours, it sometimes did it by building confederations. But it built the nation, and it built a very nationalistic identity, and it shifted towards the right. And as it did so, it built this particular National Gallery. And when this National Gallery opened, it was full of symbols of the nation. Pictures of generals, pictures of battles, and so on. And this was on the trajectory to the First World War, so this is seen as marking a stage in the development of the nation in that direction. National Gallery in Canada looks very different. It's very old actually, it goes back to the 19th century, so it's a reasonably early National Gallery. The earliest National Galleries aren't all in Europe, some are in Australia, some are in the Americas, in Latin America for example, some are very early. But this one is a glass building, it's the first big commission this particular architect had, and it looks like this because they got the money in 1988. But throughout the 20th century, they wanted money for these buildings, and they had buildings designed in competitions. And you can look at these buildings and how they changed over time, how they were very sort of bombastic and nationalistic at the beginning of the 20th century, but how they end up being very light and airy at this moment in 1988. And they would become, you know, this looks like concrete, but actually this is granite here. In time, of course, that would become steel and glass. Estonia, the National Gallery in Estonia, you can look at Estonia in a sort of post-Soviet position, so it used to be occupied by Russia, or saw itself as occupied. It thought that the Second World War didn't end until 1989. So when it's thought about its cultural institutions, it's thought about where its relationships are internationally. It's looked across the Baltic to Scandinavia and remodelled itself upon that image of culture and identity. In Rome, Rome built this building. Maxi opened a few years ago, a Museum of Contemporary Art. Again, they talked about modernising their image. They had a lot of ancient culture. They wanted to be seen as a modern culture. All sorts of countries are doing this. So Macedonia is one of the youngest countries in the world. It's 3 decades old, something like that. It's rebuilding itself in a very 19th century fashion, building itself in classical architecture and sculpture throughout the city in a really exotic and strange way, which you can look up online. But it also has adopted these older buildings. So this is an old Turkish bathhouse that's been turned into a national gallery. It shows you so they don't have any what you would call internationally great art in this particular gallery, but it still has significance. They still wanted a national gallery in their new nation. And this one's lovely. This is actually an airport terminal in Costa Rica. That was so it's symbolically significant because it was the first international airport that they had in Costa Rica. But when they changed the airport, they had that building and they turned it into a national gallery of Costa Rican art. But galleries can also be used, so national galleries can be used in a partisan political way, quite directly. So changes that have taken place in the last 5-6 years in Hungary, for example. So Hungary has shifted towards the right. It's in Central Europe, it's in that area like Ukraine, which is threatened by the countries around it. So they have political insecurities which political parties of the right can play upon. And this is what this particular government, that's still in power now, has been elected twice now, has played upon. It's developed the idea that Hungary is Christian, that the nation is threatened, and it's reached back into 19th century symbols of identity and brought them into the modern context and reused them. And they had such a majority in Hungary that they were able to rewrite the constitution. And they introduced the constitution here, January the 1st, 2012, in the National Gallery, in an exhibition that the government told that gallery to put on. And within the gallery were displayed these huge tomes, the new basic law of Hungary. So, and what this Prime Minister has wanted to do is to move Hungary more towards an autocratic state, more to be like Russia, Iran, Turkey. But the National Gallery is the place to do it. But in kind of the opposite of that kind of overt politicising, instrumentalising a gallery is something like this, which is the Orangery in Paris. This came out of a project right at the end of the First World War. So this is in effect a war memorial. So it's a place of contemplation. And when you go into this space with all these paintings by Monet around the outside, you're asked to be quiet and to go in there and to just reflect. And people do that. People are just quiet within that space. But it's an extraordinary space to be in, with a French painter around the walls there. And it is saying something about France and being in Paris. And it has national significance, but it's not saying it overt anyway. The first National Gallery is the Louvre. It was a royal project, then it became a national gallery, and in 1815 it became a royal project again, so I've argued that actually it stopped being a national gallery in 1815. But spaces like this were developed in the 19th century, and the paintings on the wall were painted to hang in the Louvre, and the Louvre was to be a place of spectacle and to symbolise the nation. And there are lots of political messages, so Napoleon would have lots of paintings produced to actually try to project his image in a particular way, not as the kind of military, combative conqueror of Europe, but rather as a man bringing democracy and sweeping aside the old dynasties of Europe. But that gallery still does that. It's still very nationalistic. Some people still have difficulty with this gallery being so nationalistic. But this is what national galleries, this is at the point of invention, what they were made to do. There are other ways we can look at national galleries. So this is a royal palace in Bucharest in Romania. And it would have been a royal palace until relatively recently. But it's now a national gallery. This is the dictator's palace in Bucharest, where Ceausescu lived, and his apartment there has been taken over by a museum of contemporary art within that building. This area here was flattened to make into a copy of North Korean planning, of course, and then there's bits of Paris in this amazing city as well, so an Arc de Triomphe there. But if you look at the museums in Bucharest, you find this is the Dictator's Palace here with the National Museum of Contemporary Art. Here, Victory Way starts, and it goes along here, and then it just goes up here like this. And you can see these green circles are the major squares in the city, and these red circles are the major museums in the city. And there's an alignment within a capital city of these symbolic structures. And museums, of course, are like sculptures and parks and parliament buildings and court buildings and libraries. They're part of a symbolic shaping of the city. So you can see the National Gallery in that context as well, as an object within the city. But then you can also look inside that object and see how it's arranged. So if something like the Hermitage is positioned on a map of St. Petersburg, you'd also go inside and see how that museum then maps the world. So if you go to the picture galleries, they're quite interesting because you find Britain as a little island off the coast of France, and Germany is, actually at the time I went, was more of Germany, there was a bigger area. Spain is always hard to collect, it's always sort of just a bit not fully understood, and then you have Italy as being very big and powerful. Well, the space allocated to these different countries is saying something about their significance in art as cultures. And the British, throughout Europe, there's always this tiny little gallery that you get to, and they always have the same painters in there. But if you think about it, the Hermitage here is authoring these nations and the art of these nations. They're selecting paintings and they're saying something about the nation. If you just go across the channel and you go to the Louvre and then you go to the gallery there of English painting or British painting, you'll find very few artists there and very few works. They've never really collected British painting. What they have collected is from all those countries that they invaded during the Napoleonic Wars, even though they gave lots of that artwork back. If you look at the map, the canon of European painting, it is actually shaped around where Napoleon's armies rode into at various times during the Napoleonic Wars. And the model of the Louvre, when people invented national galleries in other places, adopted all of that. They adopted all of those countries as well that France had favoured as being important. Now, they are important for art, but there's also a political relationship there. But there is a sense, particularly, that France is saying something about the relative value of cultures, different cultures, in making art. The 19th century was a great moment when countries all around the world were painting in a Western style. Not every country, there's some Asian countries that weren't doing that at this time, they wouldn't do that until the early 20th century, and some colonial countries would only really find their feet in the early 20th century. But in the 19th century, what you have is that there would be particular motifs. So this is one, burying people, popular in the late 19th century. And what would happen is that this would be a style of French painting, but it would then be adopted by all of these particular countries. And they would be turned into iconic, nationalistic artworks by isolating them and by giving them different meanings in different contexts. So in Norway, this is a peasant being buried, and the peasant is symbolic of, because Norway was occupied by Denmark and then by Sweden, so the peasant was always seen, in many parts of Northern Europe, it's seen as a repository of identity. It's something that once you can sweep aside your occupiers, you can go back into rural communities and discover the language and traditions that actually define you, which is what the Norwegians did. And they represented this within the painting. So this is a sort of symbolic landscape of Norway, it's the most iconic landscape. But this is also talking about the burial of the peasant, and it's about modernity and change and about identity, and it's about the nation being Norwegian. In Latin America, The Indian becomes symbolic of a pre-colonial identity, one that settlers there wanted to attach themselves to so that they could reject Spanish colonialism, for example. So again, you find this, it's the same kind of symbolism taking place there. You're going back to a different, not a peasant, an Indian. You're locating something and you're appealing to that sense of mourning and loss that you can reflect on in a very nationalistic sense. And in Australia, the pioneer gets buried. The pioneer gets buried as a reflection on those early heroic days of settlement in Australia. They're all symbolic of the nation, but they're created by isolating these paintings within nationalistic contexts. Whereas if they were hung together, they would be weakened by that association. So national galleries are manipulating these objects in these kinds of ways to give them potency. But sometimes just the space themselves seem to say something. So maybe you could guess roughly where this might be in the world. But this is a national gallery in Denmark. It looks very Danish. It's quite cool and sophisticated, and the Scandinavian galleries are. So there are lots of ways that we can take a notion like the National Gallery or the museum, and we can break it up, we can locate it in particular contexts and understand that actually for a people in a place, a museum or a gallery means a particular thing. And many of us working in the department are doing that. We're looking at those particular contexts and how it shapes the institution. We're resisting this idea of constantly talking about the museum as if we all talk about the same thing, because we don't, and you can see that in relation to the National Gallery. Scandinavia is interesting because the canon of Western painting takes place down here in these countries through the sort of centre of Europe. Scandinavia is on the periphery, but Scandinavia produced amazing paintings that were really influential at the turn of the 20th century. Only the Scandinavian national galleries collected these paintings, so they're not, well, there's some in Germany, but in Britain you won't find any or many, maybe one or two in the National Gallery. So they're mainly in Scandinavia, and the only way that the rest of the world discovers them is through temporary exhibitions, usually mounted by these national galleries. And so you can trace moments when there are waves of discovery of Scandinavian art, and people just go, wow, this is amazing, we didn't even know this stuff existed. And then after, well, those exhibitions would appear within a generation, and then they would disappear, and then people would forget, and they wouldn't think anything was going on there, or had gone on there, and then it would happen again. And Scandinavian countries in the 19th century understood that being small nations, if they worked together, they could be more powerful. And you can see that these Scandinavian countries are doing that, and they're using art to express a common identity. So, national galleries are more than great galleries, they're more than a general concept or term. You can't understand it just by going to London and looking at that national gallery. They get instrumentalised by government, but they also become important to people. So this is the National Gallery in Norway. These Norwegians are holding hands around the National Gallery because the government wanted to move it to the waterside where they wanted to build a brand new Tate Modern-like gallery and move everything there, new cultural quarter. And these people were protecting this iconic institution and these iconic works that meant so much to their identity. I can't imagine anyone doing that in London, really, around the National Gallery. Sorry?
Like the great middle class would get out.
Okay, that's me finished. Thank you for listening.